Hi everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with a special issue update on the issue of voter integrity, election integrity, voter ID, and leftist efforts to possibly steal elections. Joining us on this special program today is Judicial Watch's Senior Attorney and Director of our Election Integrity Project, Bob Popper. Bob, welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is an important issue for obviously our supporters and millions of Americans who are concerned about the lack of integrity in our election system. And we brought you on how many years ago now?
Almost six.
6 years ago to run our Election Integrity Project. And tell us a little bit about your background. How'd you end up at Judicial Watch?
Well, I worked at the Department of Justice in their voting section for 8 years. During the Bush administration, during the Obama administration, and I saw and learned how to enforce the federal laws that do exist to ensure election integrity, and I learned as well how they were not being enforced, and I'm pleased to be working at a place where they make the efforts that maybe the Department of Justice should be making.
So, and that's a nice entree into the first issue we want to talk about, which is the idea that, or it's the problem of dirty election rolls. And we did an analysis of, what is it, in 2016?
We do one every 2 years when the Election Assistance Commission, that's a federal agency, comes out with its information and its survey about the voter registration rolls of every county in the country.
And we found, at least in the last analysis, that there were 3.5 million names on the rolls that shouldn't have been there. How does that work?
Well, what we found is we compared the registration numbers, just the raw number of registrations in each jurisdiction, so that's down to the county level. Compare those to the number of citizens over the age of 18 who live in that jurisdiction. And the typical rate is actually something like 84 to 87% of that number should be registered to vote. We've routinely found counties with registration rates exceeding 100%. And 100% is a nice sort of intuitive cutoff, but the truth is 95% isn't good either. Both of those numbers and greater suggest that they're not following, those jurisdictions are not following federal law and trying to find out who's moved somewhere else and removing their registration.
So federal law, there's this national law known as the National Voter Registration Act. It's known popularly as the Motor Voter Act. So there are two key components to it. One is making sure everyone is able to register to vote, where they receive public assistance, or famously at the Motor Vehicles
Department of
Administration.
Motor Vehicles.
Right, when you go get your driver's license. So the compromise was
that jurisdictions have to take reasonable steps to make sure that only eligible voters are on their voter rolls. And the reasonable steps are fleshed out, and they include the most important category of people who might not be eligible anymore, people who've moved somewhere else. And of course, people who have died is a separate category, but by far the largest category are people who just moved and didn't cancel their registrations.
So we're getting 3.5 million names showing up as people whose names should have been removed in theory but weren't.
Right, and what it is there's 3.5 million names in all the counties that have registration rates exceeding 100%.
Oh, so that's even a low number.
It is. If you wanted to drill down to what the correct registration rate would be, we stick with 100% when we're fighting the issue because there's simply no way to deny that that's a problem. I mean, jurisdictions will tell you, oh, our citizens are very public spirited.
So they register at high rates.
That's why you have 93% registration. Well, all right, but why do you have 105% registration?
And that would be extreme. That would be extreme in terms of public activism or citizen activism, wouldn't it?
It would be, but not extreme in terms of what we've seen. I mean, we've seen in 2017 a registration rate of 138%.
So you had this motor voter bill that the left wanted, and to make it, not that the Republicans or conservatives thought this was appropriate, but the deal was that, don't worry, we'll register everybody, but we'll make sure the rolls are being cleaned. So
that was the theory.
So how was the law enforced?
Well, unequally. I would say Democrats on the left immediately started to make war on the integrity provision. They started to argue ways in which it couldn't be enforced. And in fact, what we discovered in Los Angeles County, who we sued and reached a very favorable settlement with, but what we discovered is they were told by Janet Reno's Justice Department, the Clinton's Justice Department, that they didn't have to enforce the provisions of the NVRA that they had enacted into state law because it involved a reading of the rule, which, is I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I'm a lawyer. I don't know what's boring to people. But
our viewers love this information
well,
because they don't hear it anywhere else.
Well,
So, you had this major state being advised by the Clinton administration not to clean their rolls.
And they didn't.
And they did it for the last 20 years.
Right, and you do that for 20, I mean, you do that for 5 years, your rolls are a mess. People die, people move in 5 years. Think of people you know. I mean, it just, so 20 years, it's an utter mess.
Now, but prior to California, we had filed the first, so this law hadn't been enforced. The Obama administration had zero interest in enforcing. You were there. Did you file any cases under section of the law?
I filed 5 at the Justice Department. The Obama administration filed 0.
But you were willing to do them while you worked at the Justice Department under Obama, right?
I sent constant memoranda detailing states that ought to be investigated for violations of the National Voter Registration Act, and just nothing ever happened.
And what were you told by the radical appointees that supervised you?
They're thinking about it. I mean, they truth is, they didn't want to share a lot of information with me.
But you were at a meeting where they talked about it, though, weren't you? About Section 8.
I was at a meeting. They called the entire voting section into a room, and the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and just so you know, there's
a
no
political appointee of Barack Obama.
Political appointee of Barack Obama, who was the boss of the chief of the voting section. So the boss of everyone in that room.
So your boss's boss.
Correct. Told everyone in that room that we needed to focus on the access provisions of the NVRA. That's the motor voter, the public assistance registration. And as for the integrity provisions, she said, quote, I don't care. I don't care about those.
So she didn't care about clean election rolls.
Yes, and I know this because I wrote it down and testified about it under oath to an Inspector General's investigation. So I remember very clearly what she said, but she said it to everyone. They took it as their marching orders, and we just didn't, I would have brought a case, but they did not bring a case.
So Providence brought you to Judicial Watch.
Frustration and Providence brought me to Judicial Watch.
And you were given the opportunity, we had already, by the time you got here, filed the first private lawsuits under the law to enforce that section about cleaning up the rolls.
On a statewide basis, that's right. You all, before I got here, Judicial Watch had sued Ohio and Indiana. And Indiana cleaned up its rolls,
so we were
under threat of the lawsuit.
So we ended the lawsuit.
Right. Ohio we reached a settlement with.
And that was a major settlement.
Not only a major settlement, it was litigated for years. It went up to the Supreme Court, and they confirmed our reading of the statute just last June 2008.
So the Supreme Court, because the left hated the idea that Ohio settled with Judicial Watch by agreeing to send, one additional mailing asking people, hey, are you still there?
Yeah. The mailing itself, I mean, I've never understood how you object to a mailing asking someone if they're there. That's not infringing anyone's rights. That's common sense.
And the Supreme Court said that that's not only appropriate,
that's how you read the statute.
But you probably should be doing it.
Yes, and if the Supreme Court's decision had been around when Janet Reno was giving California a pass, she would never have been able to do that. They rejected the theory that she was operating off of.
Right. So that Supreme Court decision comes down.
I will get so far in the weeds that even you will tell me to come back.
Well, I want to bring it forward now to California. So we've got these big lawsuits in Ohio and Indiana that we filed around 2012,
right.
Settled, ended with victories for cleaner elections in Ohio. Supreme Court affirmed that over the left-wing fights, the left-wing attempts to undermine it.
Yeah.
We continue our work. We sue in Kentucky. We find dirty rolls in Kentucky. We sue in California. So talk about those two cases. In California, and clean rolls in 20 years. What was the problem in Kentucky?
Well, similar issue. I mean, you could certainly date much of the problem to the election of Secretary of State Grimes. And we
A left-wing politician.
Yes, and we conducted discovery in that case and learned that they had not put anyone on the inactive list, which is where you put people when you've sent them a mailing, since 2012. I mean, they swore under oath that that was true. So in a way, it's like California. And just as a side point, the Justice Department has 30 lawyers. Okay, they should be doing this. We don't have 30 lawyers to throw at election integrity. But nonetheless, I think we've made a big impact. We got a great settlement in Los Angeles where they have to send mailings to 1.6 million inactive voters. That's 20 years worth of inactive voters in the largest county in the state.
So when you go back and look at the 3.5 million number, nationally, we've taken almost half of them potentially off of the list if they clean them up.
Yeah.
In one fell swoop.
Yeah.
And in Kentucky, it's
Kentucky, they had 48 out of 120 counties. That's 40% of their counties had registration rates greater than 100%. Because they just hadn't been enforcing it. And the reason I point out that the Justice Department should be doing this is that we only have the resources to attack the low-hanging fruit. And Los Angeles County and Kentucky were the low-hanging fruit. We're doing this study again.
Well, this year.
Right now.
Right now, as we speak, because we have the last election data from 2018.
It was released about a month ago, and we're looking at it.
So 1.6 million in California.
In LA.
And it's just in LA alone.
More in California.
250,000 in Kentucky.
More in Kentucky.
And more coming.
Yes.
So let's
say that 250,000 knocks Kentucky's statewide registration rate from 101%, now it's 96%.
So they still got a long way to go.
They got a ways to go, yes.
So let's say another 250,000 they probably need to remove.
Yeah, 91%, 90% starts to look like it could be the real world.
So I want to go through these numbers because again, we've got this big 3.5 million name problem.
Yeah.
And the reason it's a problem because these are a pool of names that are inactive. They're either dead or moved away or otherwise ineligible. And that's a name from which fraudsters can pull. That's a pool from which fraudsters can pull names to vote illegally. Well, that's why dirty election rolls are bad.
There's more. Each of those inactive registrations can be voted on election day. And I don't mean by provisional ballot. I don't mean you have to swear anything. If you walk in and you say, I'm registered at this address, and they go, well, we haven't seen you in a while. We sent you a letter, you didn't respond, we put you on the inactive list, and you say, no, I really live there. You can vote that day.
And they can't question you.
So that 1.6 million, theoretically, of course, I think they've all moved away. I think large numbers of them are dead. But if anyone on that list showed up and voted, their vote would count.
Or there was an absentee ballot that was sent or asked for or requested that would be sent or it would be sent without question.
Yes, and if someone did show up, especially in California where they don't check for your ID, I mean, there's a cascade of bad laws that make it easier for people to commit fraud. And it's the same with the absentee ballots because it is a very low courage crime to take a ballot that you got in the mail, to fill it out and to send it back.
3.5 million names, 1.5 million or 1.6 million targeted in Los Angeles County for potential removal over the next few years. Up to 500,000 in Kentucky, 250 to start, 500,000 likely in the end.
Sure.
We're bearing down on it. And in California, there's a statewide aspect of this where other counties are going to begin removing names as well.
We may have seen that.
And we're analyzing that now, because San Diego's a mess.
Well, San Diego was a mess from 2017. They had, I think they were the county with 138% registration.
Yeah, it was bad.
But that number has shrunk. They're still in the, in the red, in the black, whatever. They're underwater still. But they have removed something like 500,000 registrations.
Oh, magically after our agreement.
Well, what I love is that when we initially sent out letters to Los Angeles County, to various states and counties, and said, you really need to fix something, we've detected an imbalance, we got back a lot of abuse. Judicial Watch is not seriously going to do something.
We're the worst people. We're the worst people in the world.
Remember the Presidential Advisory Commission?
Yeah.
It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
We're tools of that.
Yeah.
In one of our cases in Discovery,
In Maryland, we asked for their list. Wonderful
in
Maryland, which is in the news now.
they asked us what was our connection to Russia.
Well, we laugh about it,
We have no connection to
but
Russia.
we laugh about it. But isn't that
Because it's
that
silly.
outrageous?
It is.
We're following the law by asking for records that are due to us under law, and the government comes back and calls us traitors.
The government that's not following the law.
Right, and they say, "Are you
back.
traitors?"
Right.
For asking questions that they're supposed to follow. But this is a sort of corruption, and it isn't even a lawsuit. It's just asking questions.
Yeah.
So in San Diego, to bring it back to the big headline, it looks like there may be another 500,000 names being removed, or will have been removed because of Judicial Watch's litigation. Is
Who
it
can
fair?
say? But the abuse stopped when we
Well,
actually started suing people, and so I don't think we'll get the same round of abuse this time. Who knows? But whatever they do, we're going to sue, and we're going to sue the targets where the answer is obvious and where they have to settle because they don't want to fight and see. They don't want the world to see how silly they've been or how disrespectful of the law they've been.
Well, the Supreme Court victory was big. I mean, the law is the law, as affirmed by the Supreme Court.
And just so you understand that suit, the plaintiffs there sued and said, look, if you even send someone a letter.
We're talking about California?
No, this is Ohio.
Oh, this is the Ohio case, yeah.
Yeah, but it applies nationwide, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah.
Supreme Court interpreting the National Voter Registration Act. The lawsuit there said, if you send a letter to someone and they don't respond, and then you remove them after 2 general federal elections, you're removing them for not voting, which another provision says you're not allowed to do. And once you parse through it, it's not, I think, a serious argument. You're not being removed for failing to vote. You're being removed for failing to respond to a notice.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court said exactly that
And on top of that,
about a year ago.
you still have to not vote in 2 subsequent federal elections.
Yes. And that's from 2 to 4 years. And so the system in Ohio was you're removed after 4 years to 6 years. And then on top of that, as I like to point out to people, it is not a life-changing event to get tossed off the voter rolls because your registration is old. The whole world is set up for you to re-register.
That's right.
It's not like losing your job or having a car accident. It's not something you're going to remember. You just go and fix it. It takes very little time to get registered to vote in any state in the union.
Well, in theory, you should show up on election day, and they probably would let
In
you
a lot
vote.
of states.
Yeah.
A lot of states.
So before we leave California, there's a big issue in California, and Republicans think they lost a lot of seats because of it. It's hard to tell whether that's actually the case or not. But they've got this extraordinary so-called ballot harvesting law,
Yeah.
which, in my understanding is, allows virtually any third party to go around to anyone and collect their ballots and deliver to them
It is.
to polling places. And that's not allowed anywhere else in the union.
It is unique in the nation. There are other provisions, and I'll tell you that there are people who discuss this issue who deliberately try to confuse the two. There are other state laws that allow, in limited circumstances, one person to pick up another person's ballot and drop it off.
So your spouse is sick, and
It's
you can bring the
typically
ballot in.
family, roommates, and most often it says that those people have to be unable to deliver the ballot themselves on account of sickness. And even in those circumstances, the most generous provision outside of California that I've seen is you can pick up 10 ballots belonging to other people. A lot of states say 6 ballots or 4 or 2. Well, in California, they just unrestricted it. You can pick up anyone's ballot for any reason in any amount.
So someone in theory could show up with 10,000 ballots.
In theory,
Or 500,
Neil
or
Kelly-
250, or 100, or 50. Those numbers aren't reassuring to anyone concerned about potential fraud.
well, and it's more than potential in the sense of the numbers, because Neil Kelly, who's the registrar of Orange County, said to a newspaper reporter. And it made it, I think, to the LA Times that people were coming in with armloads of, he said, 100 and 200 ballots.
I mean, how does that comport with any notion of clean elections is beyond me. I mean, it's almost necessarily an indicia of fraud.
Well, and just understand, the way this works is someone knocks on your door, knocks on anyone's door, and says, "I'm here to collect your ballot." I can. People are confused. I mean, the response you catch it on these doorbell cams. People are astounded. You're doing what? You want what? And they offer to help them fill it out.
So to be clear, Judicial Watch is investigating the ballot harvesting abuse in California.
Yes, we are.
So you know of what we're
talking to people, and what's more, I would ask the people watching if you know of instances in California where someone was harassed by someone knocking on their door asking for a ballot, where someone was pushy or rude. Call us. We can maybe do something about it. I mean, I think that to the extent...
Because we found that has happened in a few cases already.
Well, there are crazy stories coming out, and I think that particularly in the March primary, these stories will become insane. I think now that, this bill was always pushed...
and ironically, the March primary is of more interest to the Democratic Party, so Democratic voters are more likely to be victimized come March by these ballot harvesters who have a strong interest in getting the votes in for their candidates that they're working with or allied with.
And I think they now have it more systematized. I mean, the bill was always pushed by labor unions in California because they wanted their people to be able to go door to door. They wanted to be able to hire people, which you're allowed to do under this law, have them go door to door and pressure people for their ballots. And they even amended California law.
So wait, the labor unions, could they bring in a bunch of Russians to go and to go and collect the ballots for them?
There is a document.
I mean, I say that sarcastically, but is there any restriction as to who can do it?
No, there's not. It's not sarcastic, because there is a documented newspaper report of a dreamer, a DREAM Act person, resident in the United States, not a citizen, ballot harvesting. You can be a non-citizen. You can be a Russian. You can be, a non-Californian is nothing. You can be from any country on earth, and you can engage lawfully in ballot harvesting.
Huh. So we're compiling the idea, we're investigating the potential abuses here, and obviously we've analyzed the law to show the problems in the law itself. And so I guess the big question is, will we do anything about it? I guess we're analyzing that opportunity.
If we see that there's something to be fixed, we definitely will, and it just stands to reason that the opportunities for abuse, when someone can knock on someone else's door, doesn't have to show ID, doesn't have to give their name, doesn't have to leave any piece of paper, doesn't have to leave a receipt for a ballot, doesn't have to undergo any training, doesn't have to check in with the state, and takes this ballot, and then once they take the ballot, if it's a vote by mail ballot, and they drop it in, or don't drop it in, which happened in North Carolina, but they drop it in a mailbox, it just shows up to the state of California as a vote by mail ballot. There is no state record of it's being handled by a ballot harvester. Now, there is a place for the ballot harvester to sign, but in the law, there's no penalty for not signing it. The ballot is counted. So it is.
And they're practically speaking, they're never going to turn a ballot away, even if it's kind of brought in.
Not practically speaking, that's the law.
Yeah.
That's California law. Even if it doesn't have the signature of the ballot harvester, says Section 3011 of California's election code. They count it.
So, you talked earlier about, well, you just show up, use someone's name, you could potentially vote in their name. You've got the ballot harvesting issue. Virtually all of those issues would be severely lessened in terms of a problem on election integrity if there were strong voter ID laws. And what's the status of the voter ID issue nationally?
It is in a different. Look, thankfully with the National Voter Registration Act, we have a federal law to work with. There's no federal law in this. So
it's state by state.
It's a series of state by state constitutional challenges under either the federal or the state constitution that you can't ask someone for ID. Which, by the way, continues to strike majorities of most people as wrong, if not crazy, including majorities of minority voters, majorities of Democrats.
Well, yeah, right. Most everyone agrees on voter ID. The left,
Well, there's a very interested minority that
doesn't, and
Right.
no, but everyone. This may be surprising to many. Last I checked, and there may have been a state or two since then that have strengthened their laws. There are, I think, 10 states with quote strong voter ID laws.
It fluctuates, but yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds about
so
right.
more about, which means that it's difficult to vote on election day without a good ID.
Yeah.
Even there are a bunch of other states with voter ID laws that are weaker in the sense that
Softer provisions, yeah.
they won't necessarily stop you from voting if you don't have a voter ID.
You know, you could just affirm that you're who you say you are, and then that's a complete workaround.
Right. So in
vote.
most states, you don't need a voter ID to vote. I think most voters would. Let me be clear. If you're a voter in the United States, it's unlikely you need a voter ID to vote, relatively speaking.
I think that that's right. I think
California
so. Yeah.
doesn't have voter ID. New York doesn't have voter ID. Illinois doesn't have voter ID.
Already there. Yeah, if you're doing it by population.
Florida has probably a weak voter ID law.
Florida has its own issues.
Yes, so those are big issues.
In Florida, I just have to detour. There was a decision that was not appealed by Governor Rick Scott at the time. But
Now Senator.
There's a decision that, and by the way, the U.S. Justice Department sided with the plaintiffs in this case, and it says that non-citizens can't be removed under the National Voter Registration Act during a particular 90-day freeze period before elections. So in other words, the National Voter Registration Act protects non-citizens who were never eligible to vote. The whole purpose of that law is to make ineligible registrants get off the rolls.
So those illegal aliens or aliens who are not supposed to be on the rolls make it through that 90-day period. They're there.
They're somehow protected.
And they will have the voter ID. They might have the ID necessary to vote.
Yeah.
If they choose to break the law.
There's issues about ID. I mean, the IDs are supposed to be segregated, and typically are in a way that indicates whether it's a non-citizen's driver's license
Well,
or a
use
citizen's driver's
another
license.
ID.
Well, there's that, and it is very hard to get information out of the states with respect to what their protections are to prevent an error. Someone using an ID which indicates that they're a non-citizen to enable them to register to vote.
Now that's another big deal.
Yeah.
Which is, so you've got these. Let's say everyone had a voter ID. Everyone had a voter ID law.
Yeah.
Well, how do you get on the voter registration list? Well, you have to sign something affirming you're not a U.S. citizen, or you are a U.S. citizen for
US
federal
citizen.
elections.
Yeah.
I think there's one state that requires verification of that. Nowhere, what is it, Georgia?
It's hotly litigated, the extent to which you can deviate from the federal form. I mean, it's.
But there's one that's been grandfathered in. Nevertheless, practically speaking, there's no citizenship verification to register to vote.
Practically speaking, there is not.
So we've got how many aliens, both lawfully and unlawfully present, tens of millions of them here in the United States.
What was it 3.5% unlawful, 3.5% lawful, so 7%? Is that
So there was a study by Old Dominion University, a professor at Old Dominion University, and he did an analysis, and he found that a certain percentage of aliens, both legal and otherwise, will register to vote, and a certain percentage will vote, which to me is just like a common sense.
Yeah.
It's a question. People could fight about how many are actually doing all of that, but that was his analysis. I mean, is that a fair way of thinking about it?
Well, it was an interesting study, and it is very, very hotly contested because it does undercut all the
hotly
rhetoric.
contested by, frankly, the
Well,
leftists
yes.
who don't like the idea of requiring anyone to.
Yes, but the courts have split on this. But what that study did was very clever, which is it took an 80,000 person database online, where the people who constructed the database did not qualify it for citizenship. If a pollster goes up to someone and says, can I ask you a few questions about the upcoming election? Are you a U.S. citizen? And someone says no, he walks away. But this online site asked people if they were non-citizens, and in a separate place asked them were they registered to vote and had they voted. Now, out of 80,000, about 820 said, were registered to vote, and then a subset of that said that they had voted. Now, the argument is that that could be error, although I've spoken to the author of the study who told me that was in 2008 and 10.
He hasn't backed off from his numbers.
No, in 2012, he said 80% of the same people hit the same button, so it's looking less and less like an accident.
So those numbers are big enough to sway elections.
Well, in terms of a study, but let me tell you about some real numbers we're getting at Judicial Watch. We did a public records request to Virginia, and they indicated that within just the past couple of years, they removed thousands, was 3,000 or 4,000 people who were non-citizens who were registered, wrongfully, accidentally, fraudulently, whatever.
So this is the
These were names that they determined.
Now, did they talk about how often they had voted, if any?
No, they did not.
But if they were registered, they could have voted if they had the necessary ID to vote. I don't think Virginia has a weak ID.
Could have, in the sense of, yes, it was possible. If they did it intentionally, there are instances of people who have been deported over casting unlawful votes who were non-citizens.
So the left will tell us if there are aliens on the voter rolls, you can't believe they're voting. That obviously doesn't make any sense.
It wouldn't make sense to anyone. Where you have several thousand people registered to vote, you're going to have a certain, what did they register for?
Yeah.
You're going to have a certain cohort who are going to believe, at least rightly or wrongly, or fraudulently, that they can vote, and they're going to try to do so. And I'll tell you as well, we also found in Maryland in the course of our lawsuit there, and the dates are very sort of spongy. We're going to have to look into this more, either in this lawsuit or outside of it. But they identified about 5,000 people who'd been identified as being on the juror rolls. So these are people who had to be citizens in order to get on the federal jury rolls, but had checked the box saying that they were not citizens when it came to jury service. So, so if you follow
Well, maybe they all just didn't want to be jurors and broke the law and lied about their citizenship status.
Well, let's say that you're a U.S. citizen and you don't want to go to jury duty. Would you perjure yourself and renounce your citizenship just to avoid jury duty? I think that's extreme. Maybe there are people who will do that. But
well, I asked the question in a rhetorical fashion.
So I'm not responding to you as much as the people who make this argument.
But we've got numbers in Pennsylvania, 11,000.
I've not seen any contradiction.
In Texas, there's an argument about the numbers, but my guess is there are tens of thousands in Texas, based on the reports that you get.
Hopefully they're going to do that again and do it right, and we'll get good numbers out of Texas.
But the point being, another issue in Texas. So you got and then we have Judicial Watch confirming in Virginia and Maryland non-citizens on the registration rolls, or
and
strong indication.
States tell us.
This is the information from the states.
See, this isn't. That's why I draw a distinction. This isn't like the Old Dominion study, an estimate. These are what the states are telling us they removed. So
well, certainly consistent with the Old Dominion study.
Yes.
When I looked at the Old Dominion study, and I'll stand by my back of the envelope calculations. But if you take those numbers and apply them to the 2016 elections, it looks like Hillary Clinton got about well over 1 million alien votes illegally, if in theory, if you apply those numbers.
That was possible, and that it was possible. They don't say that this happened, but it was possible given the numbers that one state representative, one senator, and one state in terms of electoral votes.
That in 2012. In 2012,
right, based on non-citizens.
So you apply those in 2018. My guess is because there was a huge turnout in 2018, even though it was an congressional election, which typically has a lower turnout, but because of we're in the Trump era, everyone's voting.
Yeah.
I would have guessed about 900,000 illegal votes from aliens.
Well, this is the problem.
And could
have been.
But the point being, there's a study. You're using the numbers. You're applying them to the elections, and the question is, why is Judicial Watch pursuing this, asking follow-up questions? Where's the Justice Department? I mean, I'm in good faith telling you where I'm guessing these numbers to be. We're trying to figure it out. Numbers are popping up that kind of comport with our analysis.
And listen,
but where's the Justice Department on this, Bob?
When we have the opportunity to get more information, by, for example,
we're called Russians.
Well, we are, comrade. By putting a checkbox or a question on the census questionnaire for 2020, that's attacked in the courts. And against all probability, and I'm sorry, frankly, against all reason, that question was it was delayed by the Supreme Court in a way that caused the administration to abandon including it. And I understand the decision once you have the Supreme Court's ruling that certain
I would have pushed.
I's were not dotted, T's were not crossed. Well, regardless, we need that information, and there's something backwards and wrong about saying, well, we don't have information to establish the parameters of the conversation we're having. Oh, and by the way, we're going to keep you from ever getting that information. And
well, I was asked for my race in the census the other day. I don't know why that would not be objectionable while asking
personally
citizenship.
Objectionable.
What business of the government is that?
Yeah.
But evidently, the left wants us to not know about the number of foreign nationals present in the United States, either legally or otherwise, which raises the next election integrity issue, which is a fundamental assault, in my view, on our Constitution and our system, which is the challenge to the Electoral College. And we have a lawsuit in Colorado trying to get documents about Colorado buying into this revolutionary overthrow of our constitutional system. But can you talk about the Electoral College? Because people hear that and, most regular people shut down after they hear the word electoral and college.
I think it's easy to
But
understand.
many Americans are concerned about it now.
It is vital to a polyglot country like ours, where you have people with different ethnic identities in terms of how they identify themselves, not in terms of how, experts or parties identify them. How they look at themselves, people from wildly different backgrounds who have bought into, or ought, in my view, to buy into, a view of Americanism about things that we actually do right. Notwithstanding that we do a lot of things wrong, but the things that we do right, and these people want to be part of this. And one way to bind them together is to have a system where you don't elect the president from just the raw number throughout the country of who got the most votes. We have the Electoral College, and the way, leaving the details aside, the practical effect is that the winner of the presidency is the person who wins the most votes in the most places. And what it prevents is somebody who's a California candidate from getting more votes from his own backyard, where it's easy, instead of having to go to Arkansas, Nevada, Georgia, Washington State, Florida, Illinois, around the country, and getting 50% plus of the vote in the most places. It was, part constitutional, part happy accident, but it has worked out that way, and it has been good for us as a country. It has kept us from spinning apart. And, there are liberal people in this country who, in my view, would be happy to see it spin apart and are working to make it spin apart into ethnic cohorts. The Electoral College fights exactly that, and now it's being challenged by this. It's a tricky sort of dodge around the Electoral College. There's an effort to sign up states to agree that whoever gets the most votes in a particular election, that's who the state will commit their electoral votes to, regardless of the state vote. And
So California could vote for Chelsea Clinton,
right.
but if she loses the popular vote nationally, even though California may vote for Chelsea Clinton by 4 million votes,
Right.
but if she loses the popular vote nationally, all of California's electoral colleges, that state election is negated.
Yes. Yes, but the people this hurts, the states this hurts, are the smaller states. And in fact, this initiative, and it's so short-sighted in a way. It's, Democrats saying, well, we lost because of the Electoral College in the last election. Let's toss out the Electoral College. Well, it's going to save their bacon in some future.
Election would become a pure numbers game. Where can we get the most popular votes?
Well, what they realized in Nevada is that they passed this legislation, and the governor of Nevada said, I'm vetoing because, and this is a Democratic governor, realized that, no candidate would ever come to Nevada again
Well, you know, as a constitutional conservative, what concerns me about the Electoral College is that was the reason we have a constitution. It was this carefully constructed compromise that
Between big states and
big
small?
space, small states, and the small states recognized
Not
that
the point.
they might lose out in a popular vote system. So they came up with this Electoral College where the rights of the small states would be protected by giving them a say in the presidency, and the Senate as well. And now they want to tear the foundation of our Constitution apart.
By the way, this works for hundreds of years. I mean,
I don't know. I don't know if you can, any more than a state can secede from the Union. Can you undo the Electoral College that was behind the compromise that created
Well,
it?
there are a couple of, there's practical and constitutional objections. The practical objections is it's easy to sign up all the blue states for this compact.
So run up the numbers in New York and California, that's the goal.
Once you get them signed up, it's very hard. They have to reach 270 electoral votes for these laws to take effect. I don't see them doing that. But the other thing is that constitutionally, there's a provision in the Constitution saying that states cannot make compacts, one with the other, unless the compact is ratified by Congress. And this has been held to mean political compacts. You can make a compact about Port Authority.
Congress
or
could
whatever.
provide a check by refusing to approve it.
Right, and the thing is that if these states approve it, and Congress never does, and Congress never will, but because people understand there in Congress what this means to their individual states in a way that perhaps is not as commonly known, except by the governor of Nevada and by people who pay attention to these issues. But
Well, go ahead.
if they pass this and the Congress doesn't approve it, it does not have the force of law.
And it's also, speaking of voter fraud, it's an inducement for voter fraud, isn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, if the goal is to run up the numbers and get the popular vote, well,
It is easier to cheat in a few high population places than it is to cheat across the country.
Well, we were talking about ballot harvesting, lack of voter ID. Boy, well, there's a big disincentive to fix any of that if you need to get names voting for a candidate in order to get the election.
That's interesting. I'll add too that given that ballot harvesting is a California, right now monopoly, although they'd like the rest of the country to adopt this.
Right.
But given that this is in effect where you can come in with armloads of strangers' ballots only in California, the last thing you want to do is get rid of the Electoral College in an era where election integrity is not a priority, at least based on the structure of California's laws, because that's where it's places like California, New York City, Chicago, Illinois, those are the places where you run up the votes among local supporters so that you don't have to go out to the flyover states, as
Right.
liberals call them.
Well, this is it may not be an issue that as many Americans know about, like voter ID, but this is as much an attack on our republic as anything out there. And the left didn't like the outcome of elections that they lost because they weren't able to win in the states necessary as the Constitution requires. So what's their response? Tear up the Constitution.
It's short-sighted.
But-
Short-sighted. I mean, the Electoral College will be protecting a Democratic candidate for president one day, even who does not win. And bear in mind,
Well,
Bill Clinton won the most votes nationwide, but he didn't win over 50%. He won 49% of the vote.
Twice.
Yeah, so
He lost the he didn't win the majority of the majority.
So
Yeah.
it's coming. The reverse is coming, and people should not be short-sighted.
So I want to take a step back. We're talking about, I guess this is my view, and I want to ascribe them to you. The left opposes voter ID. They oppose citizenship verification in order to register to vote. The left opposes vociferously the idea of cleaning up election rolls. They're pushing ballot harvesting, which undermines the integrity of elections. They're attacking the Electoral College, which is the foundation of, I think, a fair and balanced election process that protects the rights of all Americans.
They're opposing getting more information about the number and location of non-citizens.
That's true. Well, more directly, they're encouraging the idea of having non-citizens vote in elections. To me, this is a movement that wants to be able to steal elections when necessary. Otherwise, you would have secure ballots, you would have secure voter ID, you would have making sure that the tens of millions of people who don't have a stake here in the United States aren't voting illegally.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, to me, that the left is attacking the clean elections. And you know, we can have campaign commercials, candidates running, but I tell you, if your vote is stolen, that's a fundamental assault on our civil rights, and they don't want to talk about it, but we're willing to.
Yeah.
And we're having great success, but isn't it remarkable? And I say this to because it is a Judicial Watch program, to tout Judicial Watch, how few of us are fighting on the side of election integrity here.
It is, but we're out there, and other organizations are out there, and I mean,
So
we're
two.
making
Two.
no. Well, you know, other organizations submit amicus briefs when one of these cases goes up, but yeah,
Yeah,
I'd say we're
three.
one of the leading ones.
3. Well, I'm not being sarcastic. I'm aware of 2 other groups that do this type of work from the pro-election integrity side. And one guy at the Heritage Foundation, our friend Hans von Spakovsky, who's a great leader on this as well. Now, the left has hundreds of interest groups to raid against us.
And they have
Hundreds.
volunteer forces from major law firms. All the big firms seem to contribute their time. I mean, you know, the recent fight over gerrymandering, there was a lot of big firm support for the gerrymandering point of view favored by the left. A lot of money floating around. I mean, George Soros has given a lot of money to local groups to make the fights that they're fighting. I mean, he's given money to a local group fighting a fight in North Dakota to fight the fight that you don't have to have an address, a physical address, in order to be a resident of a county able to vote.
The left-wing groups, even if they're not geared towards election integrity generally, they deploy forces when requested to push this issue. And it'd be difficult
Push
to
100 issues.
It would be difficult to overstate the amount of left-wing, the dichotomy and the array of forces between the left and the right on election integrity.
I
And
think
Republicans
that's right.
doesn't necessarily, just because the quote are Republicans out there, they're either AWOL or actually we're suing them because they're not doing what they're supposed to do to clean up the rolls. So you've got all these Soros-funded groups, these left-wing groups, attacking Judicial Watch, attacking anyone who dares takes action at the state level to promote voter ID and election integrity laws. And then it's just little old Judicial Watch. We are at the tip of the spear here.
It is exhilarating and frustrating because it's just a fire hose that we're fighting. You know, I don't like to try to think what my opponents are thinking. I mean, you know, let's just focus on the law when you're a lawyer, but you can't help it. You know, and it does often look like large segments of the liberal Democratic wing of the party are actively fighting any sort of integrity. And you know, one example I'll give you, and I don't know why this wasn't national news. Terry McAuliffe is governor at the time. A bill comes up to him, passed by the legislature, that would have taken the photo ID you gave when you went to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get your driver's license and were asked, did you want to register to vote? Now bear in mind, you sat for this photo. You willingly sat for this photo and it was put on your driver's license. And the bill would have made that photo available on the poll book.
So when you show your photo ID in Virginia, they say, hey, this matches the photo.
On my
On my
page in
record.
front of me, right.
Boy.
You vetoed that bill. Why do you veto that bill? What's the good government reason for not doing that? I mean, for the life of me, I cannot come up with one.
Well, the big smear, and I think we should clarify this, is the left pretends that these efforts are to suppress minority votes. Besides being a smear, because minority votes are often stolen in the schemes we're talking about, it's factually inaccurate because cleaner elections, the studies and the analysis show, increases minority turnout.
There's a recent peer-reviewed article studying whether, in fact, votes were suppressed in any election in the United States. I forget the exact parameters of it, but it concluded that no, that had not happened. There was no voter suppression, and this was an academic peer-reviewed study published in a major journal. Now,
So voter,
problem is-
voter suppression is a line, and that's a big lie designed to disguise the left's hatred for voter integrity
Yeah, but I would put it this way.
or election
It's a
integrity.
fundraising tool,
Well, that's true.
and it's a good one.
Playing the race card.
It's a good one. You know, and just the idea that people are out there stealing your vote, it doesn't matter if it's not happening or people are out there to get you not to vote. I mean, in a number of these cases that are brought nationally, the plaintiffs groups sometimes often have a hard time finding plaintiffs with standing to bring them. But, you know, the argument is that to anyone who wants to oppose voter ID, the sort of simple thing to say, well, I'm opposed to voter suppression. Well, everyone's opposed to voter suppression. I've never suppressed a single vote. Okay, and this study says that no one else has either. And another thing is, in state after state, and I wrote about this in an article, but you know, I think I wrote about it for North Carolina, but it was true in Georgia, in Tennessee, in Texas. They implement voter ID statutes, and turnout goes up, including minority turnout. And usually minority turnout goes up faster than non-minority turnout.
And why is that? Explain to
Well,
our listeners why that is, because it may not be readily apparent.
Well, I think that it's just the interest of these communities in voting. I don't think that, I mean, my point is more what it's not. It's not the case that a voter ID law suppresses the votes of minorities or anyone. I guess you could argue, and maybe this is what you were suggesting, that turnout goes up because people have greater faith in the integrity of the process.
And they know, because they know what goes on in their local community. And certainly, I mean, in North Carolina, we had an expert for the Obama Justice Department suggest that minorities couldn't figure out how to get voter ID, which is just patronizing and absurd. But it shows you that if this is the way they think about minorities, how would they respect their right to vote in terms of fraud?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're talking about, you know, experts who were paid, you know,
With taxpayer money.
tens of thousands, you know, I think up to $100,000, and their testimony was that minority voters are going to have a harder time figuring out the registration process and sticking with it because they care less, because they grew up in milieus that have, you know, are not as well off. I mean, it was incredibly insulting and patronizing. You know, and again, if the world were flipped and we were in the mirror world where all the media were, you know, on the right instead of all the media on the left, I think this would be an enormous scandal. The United States government paid an expert to swear and testify under oath in a federal court about different competencies of the races when it comes to registering and voting.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, I ask the people listening to us, have you heard of this?
Of course not. Well, they will have now, thanks to Judicial Watch's educational activity, which is our special report today. Hey, Bob, thank you for joining us. And for those of you concerned about election integrity, Judicial Watch has this major election integrity project. We've got ballot harvesting on the menu. We are pushing hard to make sure the rolls are being cleaned, trying to advocate for and protect voter ID, educate people on the importance of citizenship verification, and defending the basic core of our constitutional republic, which is the Electoral College. So you really need to be following Judicial Watch's leading efforts in this regard. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Bob, for joining us as well.
Great to be here.
Thank you.